Okay, so like I said, we're going to be continuing on our notes, and then we will be watching a few videos that relate back to our notes. So we talked yesterday about evolution a little bit. So this idea of evolution, evolution tells us that over time species have changed. That the species we see around us today, they were not always exactly as they are today. The species we have today, some of them were not around in the past. And some organisms, some species that were alive in the past are no longer around. So all of this can be explained through evolution. All these similarities, we can understand why a whale has certain similarities to a wolf. Right? Evolution can help explain to us why they have some similarities, even though a whale lives in the water and looks more like a fish, but has more similarities to actually a mammal. So we'll be talking about those things in a second. All right, so let's start by saying, okay, well, how do we know this? So how do we know these species have changed over time? And one of the best ways we have of understanding this is through fossil evidence.
The bats' bones look like really
Yeah,
long.
we're going to talk about that. So a fossil is when an organism dies and gets buried in like sediment and mud or sand. Sometimes, if conditions are right, those bones can be preserved, and the bone matter is replaced with minerals and actually turns into a sort of rock. And that's what we have when we look at these fossils, fossilized remains of different species. When we look at the fossil evidence, we see that some species are no longer around, some have changed over time, and so forth. Fossils give us some great evidence of that. Another part of this evidence is the common structures, that species that are closely related, if we look carefully at the way their bodies are arranged, there's many similarities. So for example here, this diagram shows us the limbs and the bones inside of a bird's wing, a bat's wing, a human arm, a lion, a horse, a frog, and a whale. So if we look, for example, look at the human arm. So we know from our own anatomy, we have one upper arm bone, or humerus. We have two bones in our forearm, the ulna and radius. And we have a bunch of wrist bones and then the finger bones. And they're shown here. If you look at the wing of a bat, does it look similar? Look at the upper arm. One bone, two bones. What are these bones in the bat's wing?
Fingers.
They're like our fingers. So really, when you look at the bones inside of the wing of a bat, they're very similar to the bones that are in other mammals. They're just a little bit longer in certain ways, and they have a layer of skin stretched over them, but they're really the same kinds of bones. Look at the whale. Inside of the flipper of a whale, you may think it's just like a fin of a fish, but it's not at all. There are bones inside of a whale's flipper, and look at the bones. One upper arm bone, two forearm bones, and what's inside of there?
Fingers.
Yeah, the bones that would be like our finger bones. They're all inside of a whale's flipper, even though it's all covered in a layer of muscle and skin tissue. They're still there. So what does that tell us about whales? How does this help us understand evolution, Maggie? Yes, that they probably, whales and humans and bats, what we say is they probably had a common ancestor. It means if you trace back in the past, probably whales and humans and bats had a common ancestor somewhere in the distant past. And that's why they have these similarities. If you look at the bones in the bird's wing, do they look as similar?
Yeah.
No.
No, but they saw the arm bone.
They look quite a bit different. And so that tells us probably they did not have that same common ancestor that the other animals did. So looking at the structures that different animals have can help us understand how they've evolved. So which is more closely related, a whale and a shark? Let's say a dolphin and a shark, or a dolphin and a bear.
Dolphin and bear.
What would most people probably think though? Yeah, they both are in the water, they have similar body shape, fins, flippers, but when we really look at them, no, they're mammals. Whales and dolphins are mammals. They have more similarities. I don't know what happened in the past. You could just go without it for now. All right. Another way we can think about how species have evolved is by looking at where they're located. We call this the species distribution. Often, organisms that live close to one another are similar to each other because they probably also have a common ancestor. And sometimes when you have an isolated area, you end up with species that are quite unique from anywhere else. Think about places like Australia or Madagascar. These are areas where there's lots of different organisms that have unique characteristics because they're sort of separated from the other species. We can also look at the DNA of various species. The more similar the DNA of two species is, the more closely related they are. And we can analyze that today using special techniques we have. If we analyze the DNA of, let's say, a dolphin and a bear, and compare that to the DNA of a dolphin compared to a shark, we'll see it's much more similar between a dolphin and a bear than between a dolphin and a shark. There's more similarities because, again, the dolphin and the bear have a common ancestor not that long ago versus the shark and the dolphin. Just like with people. Do you share a lot of characteristics, a lot of DNA with your brother or sister? Yeah, of course. We all do. That's because you have a common ancestor. Who's the common ancestor of you and your brother or sister? Your parents. Who's the common ancestor of you and your cousin, your first cousin? No? Because your uncle is not your ancestor, right? Eddie?
Your mom or your dad?
No, because your mom or your dad are not your cousin's parents. Hannah? Your grandparents. You and your first cousins have the same grandparents, right? How about you and your second cousins? Not grandparents.
Parents?
Great grandparents. And so as we keep going, we're getting more farther and farther away. Your third cousins, you have to go back several generations to find your common ancestor. Okay? And your fifth cousins, you have to really go back a long time to find when you have a common ancestor. The same is true sort of when we think about species evolving. Okay? The more closely related species are, you don't have to go back quite as far to find their common ancestor. All right, so that's how we know species have changed over time, but how do they actually change? That's the next question we need to ask. Okay? Happens through this process called natural selection. You look here, if I have some mice, and I have this predator of the mice, okay, a bird. So the mice have some variation in their fur color. Some are darker, some are lighter. Which ones do you think are going to be eaten more by this bird? Guy?
Lighter ones?
How come?
Because they're easier to see.
Yeah, they stand out more. So probably the birds are going to eat those more often than they eat the gray ones. So as they do that, what's going to happen to these mice? Right?
But the lighter color ones are going to be less popular.
Yeah, the lighter color ones are going to start to become fewer and fewer because they're eaten more often. What about the darker ones? What can happen to them, Val?
They won't be as less.
Yeah, so what can they do then?
Grow more.
They can survive, and if they can survive, they can also reproduce. When they have little mice babies, what are they probably going to be like in terms of their fur color? Similar to their parents. So over a period of time, what's going to happen to the color of this species of mice? Guy?
There'll be more gray ones than white ones.
Yeah, it's probably going to be more and more of the gray ones and fewer of the white ones. Okay, some of these are better adapted to their environment. And the members of a species that are better adapted can survive and therefore reproduce. What happens to the mice that are not well adapted to their environment? Maggie?
They'll be eaten.
Yeah, they don't survive. Okay, they don't survive, and if they can't survive, they also cannot reproduce, and they can't pass on their genes to the next generation. All right, so we have some steps when we talk about natural selection. But
What was the writing for the first one? For the first one?
the first one here,
Yeah.
survive and reproduce.
No, the one.
Oh, nothing. We didn't write anything. We didn't fill it. I just asked you that question. But over time, the gray mice become more common. All right, so species evolve. We have to start here. This process is called natural selection. And it's really not very complicated. It just says basically the individuals that are best adapted, that are best suited to their environment, will be able to survive better and therefore reproduce, passing on their traits to the next generation. Any individual who's not well adapted was going to die off without reproducing. And so over time, any characteristic, any trait that's beneficial, that's helpful to a species, will become more and more common. Any harmful trait will become less and less common. And this leads over many generations to the evolution of the species. And this is why we have such a great number of different living things on the earth, because species over time have evolved, have all sorts of different characteristics. All right, so we say that there are kind of four main steps of evolution through natural selection. First is variation. What does variation mean? What does that word mean? Michael?
Things different.
Yeah, it means differences. If you think about your classmates in class, or if you go to cafeteria, are we all humans?
Yeah.
But are we all different from each other?
Yes.
Yeah, we have many differences. Differences in our height, in our hair color, in our eye color, skin color, and how long our necks are, and how long our arms are, how big our hands are, and how our bodies work even, we have some differences. So there's lots of differences between a species. Now, are squirrels different from each other? Yeah. We don't really see it as much because we're not squirrels. But squirrels probably look just as different to each other as you and I look from each other. But we're not squirrels, so they probably just think all humans look the same. They can't tell us apart. Okay? But all species have variation. It's just part of how living things operate. So each individual is unique. Now sometimes these variations can be helpful to the species, to the individual. Sometimes they can be harmful. Sometimes they don't make a difference either way. If the trait or the characteristic is something that's helpful, we say that it has adaptive value. That it's helpful, it's beneficial, has value to the species. So that's the first step. There's variation. There's differences between all the individuals. The next important step is that in nature, there is always a struggle for survival. There's There's a struggle for survival because usually there's not enough food, not enough water or homes or living space for every single individual to survive. For example, one female salmon can release hundreds of thousands of eggs at one spawn. Do they all get fertilized and grow into fish?
No.
No, only a very small percentage. There's just
How come?
not enough. Well, sometimes they're not fertilized by the male. Sometimes even if they are, there's not enough food for them to grow. Some of them are eaten by predators. Some of them just have genetic problems and don't grow. So there's all sorts of reasons why they don't all survive. In fact, they could. If they all survive, our rivers would just be clogged with fish.
Unless if we fished every day.
So they don't all survive. There's a struggle. Which ones do survive?
The ones that got taken care of, right, and didn't have any problems.
The ones that didn't have any problems. The ones that are best suited to their environment. Okay? Best adapted, we would say, individuals. They are the ones that survive. For example, in those salmon eggs, what if one of them, because of some weird genetic thing, happens to be born as bright green? Do you think it would survive?
No.
No, it probably would stand out to predators and be eaten pretty quickly. So the best adapted are the ones that can survive. And if they can survive, they can go on to the next step, because living species eventually will reproduce. So whatever ones can survive, and they can reproduce, and when they do, they pass on their characteristics to the next generation. And this happens generation after generation after generation.
Why did they call it offspring?
I don't know, it's just the term that's used. And so over time this happens, and the entire species can take on these traits. Over many, many generations, the entire population has these traits. We call that an adaptation. Trait that helps that species survive. Let's take my salmon egg example again. What if one of those salmon eggs, because of some DNA, it happens to be the outside of the egg a little bit sticky, and it sticks to the gravel and doesn't get washed down the stream like some of the other eggs? Would that make it maybe more likely to survive? Could be.
What if it was sticking, got washed down what?
And didn't get washed down the river with many of the other eggs. It stayed in place so it can stay there, be fertilized, and grow. Well, if that did happen to one egg, and it did survive and grow into a fish, maybe it survived better than the others. And then when that egg reproduces, when that hatches into a fish, that fish is going to have those same characteristics as well. And so over time, that may become more and more common in this fish, and eventually the whole species might have those.
It almost seems like breeding a
It is. It's always about which one has the best traits, the best characteristics that are going to allow it to survive. All right, we're going to stop our notes for now. I want to show you some couple video clips here to help us understand natural selection. No,